Cypress Bend Plantation, November 28, 1867. The air was thick with wood smoke and bourbon, the kind that clung to your throat and left the walls humming. Inside the grand dining room, laughter spilled like liquor, rich, careless, and cruel. Colonel William Rutledge and his 3 sons sat around a table heavy with silver and sin, waiting for their Thanksgiving feast. They toasted to progress, to peace, to a South reborn. Outside, the cane field stood still, listening. In the kitchen, the air told a different story. Iron pots hissed under fire. Pork lard bubbled in a great brass kettle, shimmering gold under the flames. The scent of clove, vinegar, and smoke filled the room, warm, almost comforting, if not for the woman standing before it. Esther Carter moved like she belonged to the fire. Her hands, worn and sure, stirred the pot with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Her face, half lit by the hearth, gave away nothing. She had cooked in that kitchen since girlhood. Cooked through storms, through beatings, through births and burials. And now, after 3 decades, she was cooking her last meal there. Upstairs, the colonel's sons argued over business. Nathaniel, the eldest, bragged about contracts in the north. Thomas laughed too loud, proud of a future built on the backs of men still unpaid. And Silas, the youngest, the cruelest, sat quietly, sipping whiskey, watching the window where the kitchen light flickered through the dark. He always watched that light. Esther could feel it, the same stare that once followed her through the halls, through years. He used to smile when he said her daughter had been sent north to a better life. That smile still burned in her memory, sharper than any flame. Outside, the night wind carried the sound of hounds barking, restless, hungry. A wagon rattled over gravel. The fields whispered in the dark, remembering things no one dared speak of. Esther listened, not to the men upstairs, but to the rhythm of the boil. She had learned from her mother that every pot has its own voice. This one sang a song of endings. From the parlor, the colonel's laughter echoed again, heavy, false, echoing through the walls that had held too much history. "Esther," someone called. "You best hurry with that bird, woman. We're starving in here." She didn't answer. She wiped her hands on her apron, eyes fixed on the flame. The turkey was ready, but so was something else. As she reached for the kettle's lid, the light from the fire caught the edge of her face, and for the first time in years, her lips curved, not in service, but in certainty. Thanksgiving had begun. Cypress Bend wasn't just land. It was a monument built on bones. To the outsiders riding past on wagons, the plantation looked almost peaceful, long rows of sugarcane swaying in the wind, the big house painted clean and proud. But if you walked closer, if you listened, you'd hear it breathing. You'd hear the ground creak with memories it never asked to hold. They called it reconstruction, but nothing had been rebuilt. The war had ended, sure, but only on paper. The same hands that once held whips now held ledgers. The same men who called themselves masters now called themselves employers. And the people who had been enslaved, they worked the same fields, under the same sun, for pennies instead of chains. Freedom, they called it. Esther Carter knew better. Every wall in the big house had seen too much. The parlor rugs were bought with sugarcane blood. The silver on the dining table was polished with the sweat of women who slept on dirt floors. Even the piano, the one Silas played on Sundays, pretending at grace, had keys that still smelled faintly of smoke. Esther had walked those halls all her life. As a child, she'd carried bread trays past the portraits of men in stiff collars and women with hollow eyes. Those eyes followed her everywhere. She learned early what silence could save and what words could kill. When she was young, she thought the house was alive, a living thing that fed on breath, on pain, on secrets whispered too close to dawn. Years later, she realized she was right. The Rutledge family had survived the war by turning cruelty into business. Colonel William Rutledge wore a Union pin on his lapel, bragged about progress, and preached mercy, while signing labor contracts that might as well have been slave papers. His sons learned from him well. Nathaniel ruled the fields with fists. Thomas ruled the kitchen with insults. Silas ruled the silence. When night fell, they drank bourbon and bragged about redemption. But redemption, at Cypress Bend, was a word soaked in irony. The house was never rebuilt. It simply learned to lie better. Esther had seen men come and go, politicians, soldiers, preachers, all telling her freedom was here now. But every time she returned to that kitchen, she knew the truth. The plantation was a mouth, and it was still eating. On that Thanksgiving morning, the house looked brighter than usual. The windows were open. Music drifted from the parlor. But if you looked close, the paint on the walls had begun to crack. The air carried the faint scent of rust and lard, the same scent that clung to Esther's hands as she stirred the pot. For everyone else, Thanksgiving was a day to give thanks. For Esther Carter, it was a day to finally stop feeding the beast. Before she was Esther Carter, the cook, the ghost, the whispered name, she was just Essie, a barefoot girl chasing fireflies behind the kitchen house. Her world was small then, a stretch of muddy yard, a patch of cane taller than her, and a mother whose hands smelled of smoke and salt. Her mother's name was Binta, and her voice carried a rhythm older than the land itself. She used to hum when she cooked, soft, steady songs that wrapped around the air like prayers. When the pot boils, Binta would say, you don't scream. You wait. You watch. Then you feed it what it needs. Essie never understood what that meant, not until much later. She was 12 the first time she saw what the house could do. Her father, Jonas, was accused of stealing a tin of molasses. The colonel didn't need proof. Men like Jonas didn't get the luxury of innocence. They tied him to the iron cross behind the smokehouse, the same one they used for curing pork. For 2 days, he hung there under the sun while the air filled with flies and whispers. On the third morning, when Essie brought breakfast to the guests, she saw Silas, then just a boy, throwing rocks at her father's body.
She didn't cry.
She watched. That was the day the silence settled inside her. It became her armor, her inheritance, her only safe language. By 15, she had the hands. That's what the house called it, the hands. It meant she could season anything, taste truth in a broth, make a stew that softened the heart of the cruelest man. The kitchen became her world, her shield, and her cage. She learned which herbs soothed pain and which sharpened it. She learned how to carve meat so fine it fell apart under a breath. She learned that fire, like anger, could be patient, could wait. But she also learned something darker. Every meal she cooked was a reminder of what the house had taken. Every dish that left her stove was a prayer swallowed by the same mouths that had laughed when her father died. Still, she stayed. Because leaving meant forgetting. And forgetting, in a place like Cypress Bend, was the one sin even the dead refused to forgive. At night, when the others slept, she'd sit by the back door, staring out at the swamp. The cicadas sang, the wind carried the smell of wet cane, and somewhere out there, she swore she could still hear her mother's voice, that low hum, telling her again, when the pot boils, don't scream. Essie didn't know it yet, but her pot had already started to simmer. The morning the letter came, the air felt wrong.
Too still.
Too quiet. Even the dogs outside seemed to sense it. Esther, still called Essie then, was scrubbing the kitchen floor when the colonel's messenger rode in, dust rising behind his horse like a small storm. He handed the note to Thomas Rutledge, who was barely 20 and already wearing his father's cruelty like a second skin. He read it aloud, half smiling. Payment received in full. The girl Clara Carter has been sent north to apprenticeship. Apprenticeship? That was the word they used when they meant sold. Essie froze. Her daughter, Clara, was only 7. Bright-eyed, curious, with hair that smelled of sweetgrass and questions too big for her age. She'd been born in that very kitchen, beneath the shelf of spice jars her mother used to reach for. Now she was gone, traded for a debt. A child reduced to ink on paper. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. The women in the quarters whispered her name that night. The men looked away. And when the colonel's sons came home for supper, they didn't meet Esther's eyes. Only Silas, the youngest, dared to speak. He leaned against the doorway, that same crooked smile on his lips, and said, "Don't fret, Auntie. Maybe the girl's lucky. Maybe she'll learn to cook better than you." That was the moment something inside Esther cracked, quiet as bone beneath weight. She walked into the swamp that night. The sky was heavy with thunder, the air thick enough to choke. She didn't cry, not the way people cry when they want pity. She screamed into the trees until even the frogs stopped singing. Then she knelt in the mud and swore that if the world would not bring her child back, she'd make it remember her. When she returned to the kitchen, her hair was wet, her eyes dry, and her hands bleeding from roots she'd torn bare. She cooked anyway. A stew, red, thick, heavy with spice. No one noticed the difference that night, but she did. Every spoonful carried the taste of something new, purpose. From that day on, Esther became what the house needed her to be: silent, obedient, invisible. She laughed when expected, bowed when ordered, and never again spoke Clara's name. But inside her, something had changed. She began to collect things small, ordinary, almost invisible. A bit of cloth from Clara's dress. A nail etched with a flower. A knife her mother once held. Little pieces of her life tucked away behind loose floorboards, waiting. For years, the house thought it had broken her. But what it had really done was teach her how to wait, and how to feed the fire the right way. The night before Thanksgiving, the kitchen at Cypress Bend didn't sleep. Logs cracked in the hearth like knuckles before a fight. Iron pots hissed and muttered under the weight of boiling lard. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, cloves, and something else, something older, waiting. Esther moved through the haze like she belonged to it. Bare feet whispering against a pinewood floor, apron damp, wrists wrapped in cloth. She worked alone, though the other servants had offered to help. She told them to rest. The holiday would be long, she'd said. No one argued. They knew that tone, quiet, final. The men upstairs were already half drunk. Their laughter rolled down the hallways, bruising the silence. Every burst of noise made the fire flare, as if it too were listening. Esther laid out the dishes one by one. Hens stuffed with herbs, sweet potatoes glazed in molasses, cornbread cooling on the windowsill. She polished the silverware until it gleamed like small, sharp mirrors. Everything had to be perfect. Perfect and final. She paused once to look around the kitchen, her kingdom, her cage. The walls had darkened from years of smoke, the floorboards carved with burn marks and knife scars. In one corner, near the pantry, was a little carving in the wood, a flower etched with a nail the day Clara was born. She ran her fingers over it, just once, then pulled her hand away. The pot of lard simmered quietly beside her, patient, golden, steady. She didn't need to test the temperature. She could feel it in the air, in her bones.
It was almost ready.
On the shelf above the stove sat her mother's knife, wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it slowly. The blade was short, almost delicate, worn down from decades of use. Her mother's words came back to her. When the pot boils, don't scream. Feed it what it needs. Esther pressed the knife against her palm, just enough to feel the edge. Then she whispered, "Time to feed it." Outside, thunder rumbled far off over the swamp. Rain threatened, but didn't fall. The air hung heavy with that strange, electric stillness that always comes before the world changes. She added more wood to the fire, stoking it higher. The flames licked the brass kettle until it began to sing, that low, haunting sound only metal makes when it's ready to burn. From the dining hall came Silas's voice, slurred with whiskey. "Esther, you got that bird ready? Or are you waiting for it to fly in on its own?" Laughter followed, sharp, hollow, ugly. Esther didn't answer. She just looked toward the kitchen door, her hand resting on the ladle, her reflection flickering in the brass. The house thought it was preparing for Thanksgiving. But Esther knew better. It was preparing for judgment. The morning broke slow and heavy, thick with heat that clung to the skin like guilt. Cypress Bend smelled of sugarcane and storm water. Inside the big house, the rut-led men woke late, hungover, loud, alive.
For now.
By noon, the feast was ready. The table gleamed beneath the chandelier, roasted hens, candied yams, bread rolls puffed golden. And in the center, the brass kettle of lard shimmered, waiting to fry the turkey to perfection. The men never noticed the way the flames licked higher than usual, or how the scent of smoke had turned sharper, more like iron than fat. Esther Carter stood in the doorway, quiet as shadow. She served without speaking, the way she always had, pouring wine, carving meat, clearing plates. The men joked, bragged, filled the air with noise. Nathaniel boasted of rail contracts. Thomas laughed about civilizing freedmen in Mississippi. Silas said little, but his eyes stayed fixed on her, the same eyes that had lied about her daughter. Every time Esther passed him, he smiled. That old, easy cruelty, like a scar that never healed. Finally, he said, "You've been cooking for us so long, Auntie. I reckon you'll miss us when we're gone." Esther met his gaze, steady and calm. "Don't you worry," she said softly. "Y'all eating real good this year." They laughed, thinking it a joke. She turned back toward the kitchen. Inside, the kettle trembled, a low, rolling bubble that sounded almost alive. The air shimmered above it, waves of heat warping the edges of everything. Esther picked up her mother's knife and the long wooden paddle. The room around her seemed to hold its breath. The first one to enter was Nathaniel. He swaggered in, half drunk, wiping sweat from his neck. "Need a hand, old girl?" he drawled, lifting the lid from one of the pots. "Don't want you keeling over before the meal's done." His hand reached for the kettle's handle. Esther's hand caught his wrist, strong, unshaking. Their eyes locked. "You don't touch what you don't understand," she said. For a moment, the kitchen went silent. Even the fire seemed to pause. Then Nathaniel chuckled and walked out, muttering something about uppity cooks. The moment he was gone, Esther exhaled, slow, steady, and fed the fire one last piece of wood. The lard roared. The kettle began to quake. The sound was no longer a simmer. It was a growl. From the dining room came Silas's voice, sharp and impatient. "Esther, bring us that turkey." She picked up the carving knife. Her reflection stared back at her in the blade, older, harder, ready. The footsteps came again, heavy, careless. The door opened. Silas leaned in, smirking.
He said.
"Smells like tradition." Esther didn't turn. She just stirred the pot once more. "It's ready," she said. And when he stepped closer, the world finally boiled over. Silas Rutledge took one step too close. The smell of hot lard and smoke filled his lungs, sweet and heavy like sin. "Where's the turkey, Auntie?" he mocked, leaning over the pot. "You hiding it under your apron?" Esther's hands didn't shake. In one smooth motion, she lifted the wooden paddle and swung. The sound cracked through the air, wood against bone. Silas staggered, clutching his face. Before he could curse, she gripped the kettle's handles, heaved, and tipped it forward. The lard poured out like liquid sun. It hit him chest first, swallowing his scream before it could finish. The smell of burning skin filled the room, sharp, animal, final. He stumbled back, thrashing, his hands clawing the air. But the fire clung to him, kissed him, claimed him. His knees buckled, and he fell into silence, the same silence she had lived with for 30 years. For a heartbeat, the kitchen was utterly still. The fire popped. The walls groaned. Esther's chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate rhythm. Then the shouting started upstairs. Footsteps thundered down the hall. Nathaniel's voice, angry, wild. Thomas right behind, his words slurred with fear. "She's lost her damn mind. Get the rifle." Esther didn't run. She stepped over the body, calm, deliberate. The kettle hissed beside her, still smoking. On the pantry shelf, another pot waited, one she'd set aside hours ago, cool and heavy, just in case. The door burst open. Nathaniel appeared first, face red, rifle shaking in his hands. Thomas followed, clutching a fireplace poker, pale as flour. Neither asked about Silas. They already knew. "Drop it," Nathaniel shouted. "You crazy witch." Esther didn't blink. "You think crazy cooks meals for murderers?" she said softly.
No, baby.
Crazies believing you can keep eating and never get fed back. Nathaniel lunged. The gun fired wide, tearing through the shelves and showering beans across the floor. Esther moved like smoke. She ducked behind the stove, grabbed the cold pot, and swung it hard. The edge caught him across the face, a flash of red, then the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Thomas tried to run. She was faster. The knife pinned his hand to the floor, clean, sure, deliberate. His scream filled the kitchen. "You remember Clara?" she hissed. "You watched them take her." He sobbed, tried to speak, but only choked on his own breath. Esther's voice softened, almost tender. "She was 7, she said. And I've been boiling this moment ever since." Nathaniel groaned, trying to rise. She grabbed the skimmer from the wall, wide, flat, iron, and brought it down again and again until he stopped moving. When the noise finally faded, the kitchen was quiet again. The lard hissed its last breath, the smell of judgment thick in the air. Esther Carter stood in the center of it all, trembling, yes, but not from fear.
From release.
From remembering. For the first time in her life, the house had finally gone still. The house was silent. Not the kind of silence that follows prayer, the kind that follows truth. Smoke curled through the rafters, slow and ghostly. The floor glistened with spilled oil and blood, the air thick enough to chew. Esther stood in the doorway, her apron torn, her arms trembling, the kettle empty beside her. She listened. No footsteps. No shouts. Just the sound of wood settling and the faint pop of dying embers. It was done. She turned toward the pantry, pried up the loose floorboard she'd loosened days before. From the dark beneath, she pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a satchel no bigger than her hands. Inside were her mother's pendant, a few coins, a handkerchief stitched with Clara's initials, and a strip of cloth stained dark from years of memory. She tied it tight and slung it over her shoulder. As she stepped through the dining hall, the portraits stared down at her, the Colonel's ancestors, stiff and colorless. For years, their painted eyes had watched her serve their lineage. Now she stared back. "You full yet?" she whispered. No answer. Outside, the air hit her like baptism, wet, cold, alive. The swamp called in the distance, its sounds low and endless. Cypress trees stood like sentinels in the mist, their roots tangled in secrets too old for words. Esther walked toward them without looking back. Behind her, the great house stood still. She'd thought once about burning it, watching it collapse into the same fire it had forced into her bones. But no. Fire was mercy. Silence was the punishment. Let them find what she'd left behind. Let them smell it. Let them remember. The path to the swamp was narrow, half swallowed by cane and vines. Every step sank into mud that pulled at her feet, as if the land itself wanted to keep her there. She pushed on, the bundle against her back, her breath steady. She whispered names as she walked, her father's, her mother's, her daughter's, each one a drumbeat, a tether to the world that tried to forget them. The swamp listened. It always did. When she reached the edge of the marsh, she stopped and turned for one last look. From that distance, the house seemed smaller, fragile even, a pale shell against the trees. You could almost believe it had never been powerful. Esther smiled, faint and tired. "Ain't no house built on blood gonna stand forever," she murmured. Then she stepped into the water. It was cool, thick with the scent of moss and rain. The trees swallowed her whole, and the mist closed behind her like a curtain. By the time the first dogs came sniffing at the edge of the fields, there was no trace of her, only footprints leading into the swamp, and the faint smell of smoke that refused to fade. They found the bodies 3 days later. Silas was the first, blistered, bloated, curled beside the overturned kettle like a man caught mid-prayer. Nathaniel lay near the pantry, his jaw shattered, his rifle rusted in a pool of dried lard. Thomas lasted a little longer. When the doctor arrived from Baton Rouge, the boy could only whisper one word before slipping into silence. "Esther." The plantation froze. No one worked the fields. No one sang. Even the dogs refused to go near the house. They said the air inside had changed, too heavy, too hot, like something unseen still breathing. By dusk, word reached the colonel. He came home in black gloves and silence. The servants scattered before him, crossing themselves when he passed. Inside, the great hall smelled faintly of iron and death. He stepped into the kitchen, the heart of his empire, and stopped. Everything was still where she'd left it. The table overturned, the kettle scorched black, her apron folded neatly by the hearth. The colonel sat down on a stool, lit a cigar, and stared at the fire that refused to die. She was just a cook, he muttered. But the word sounded wrong, too small, too soft. He didn't sleep that night. He paced the halls, talking to walls that didn't answer. The servants heard him shouting her name, swearing he could still smell the lard burning. By midnight, the laughter that had once filled the house had turned to screams. When morning came, the colonel was gone, found kneeling before the hearth, eyes open, skin cracked like old leather. The kettle beside him was empty. He hadn't poured it. He had just waited. The papers called it madness. The people in the fields called it justice. No one stayed at Cypress Bend after that. Workers fled. Overseers refused the job. The sugarcane grew wild, twisting over the fences, swallowing the path to the house. They said the land itself had turned against anyone who tried to tame it again. Years later, a white man from St. Francisville tried to reclaim the property. He brought laborers, guns, promises of a new start. By sundown, he and his men were gone, pale, shaking, silent. He told the town it was the smell that drove him out. But others knew better. It wasn't rot. It was memory. They called it the curse of Cypress Bend, the house that wouldn't die, the kitchen that never cooled, the smell of oil that hung in the air each November like the breath of something watching. No one dared say her name out loud. Not in the fields. Not in the quarters. Not even in church. But in the kitchens, the dark, hidden places where women stirred pots and whispered truth over fire, her name was still spoken. Not as fear, as warning. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 10, The Woman Who Became a Warning next, the final chapter? They never found her body. Search parties scoured the swamps for weeks, but the bayou gives back what it wants, and it didn't want to give back Esther Carter.
Some said she drowned.
Some said she ran south and changed her name. But most, the ones who knew how stories travel, said she never left. They said she became something else. Years passed, and the house at Cypress Bend sank deeper into the earth. The cane grew crooked and wild, the windows cracked, the roof sagged like a tired spine. But every November, when the moon hung full and the air turned heavy, people swore they could hear the sound of oil hissing in the dark. A slow, steady boil, and a whisper that sounded almost like her name. Esther. The children in the quarters learned the story first. Their grandmothers told it while stirring pots at dusk, how a cook fed her masters what they'd fed the world. How she turned silence into fire. How she made justice smell like smoke and salt. It wasn't just a ghost story. It was a survival story. In Louisiana kitchens, women began to hum when they cooked, low, rhythmic, the same way Binta once had. Some said it kept the food honest. Some said it kept the men honest too. And when tempers flared, or when a man raised his hand too fast, someone would always mutter, "Careful now. Esther's watching." Generations came and went. The war faded into textbooks. The names of generals filled monuments. But Esther's name lived in whispers, in the way a pot sounds when it begins to boil, in the scent of grease too hot to touch, in the pause before someone tells a lie too close to history. They say once, decades later, a young kitchen boy in Mississippi stopped a man from beating the cook. The man demanded to know why, and the boy said quietly, "My mama told me about Esther." That was all it took. The belt never swung again. Maybe Esther died in that swamp. Maybe she found her daughter. Maybe she just walked far enough until the land forgot her name. But stories like hers don't stay buried. They rise, one simmering breath at a time, until they fill the world again. So when you hear the hiss of oil, the crack of fire, or the hum of a woman cooking in silence, remember her. Remember the hands that fed the empire and then burned it clean. Because Esther Carter wasn't just a cook. She was the heat that truth needs to live.
Fire the end.
Would you like me to now craft the closing YouTube outro segment? A cinematic, emotionally resonant ending that ties her legacy to the viewer and encourages engagement, likes, comments, and subscriptions in a natural way?